Hi everyone. In this episode of the Bot Next Door, I'm talking to Ravit Dotan, a practitioner and researcher in the field of AI ethics. And today we talk about how startups and professional investors can implement AI ethics. By the end of the conversation, we get into a more philosophical kind of topic, which is if you want to be ethical, how do you pick your values? Enjoy the conversation. Without further ado, here's Ravit Dotan. All right. Hello, Rabbit. I'm going to ask you as a first question a question that I got so many times from my grandmother. And that question is, as a VP of responsible AI, what exactly is your job? What do you do for a living?
Okay, yeah. I'll start with saying that is actually one of my jobs, multiple. So I'll kind of say what the things that I'm doing are, and then I'll explain what I do under this title of VP of
Sure.
Responsible AI at Mission Control.
Hmm.
So I am, I have a mission in my career, and it's a modest mission. And it's just to make all AI responsible. A very modest mission, which I'll probably accomplish by like next month, the latest, you know?
Most
Um,
likely.
and so to promote this goal, I have decided to target two specific audiences or two specific activities. One is those who develop AI systems or technology more broadly, because where does the line cross? Like, is it AI? Is it not AI? But yeah, those who develop the technology is one audience I'm targeting. And then those who invest in the technology is the other audience that I'm targeting. And so for both of these audiences, I'm interested in two kinds of questions. One, the most important question, in my opinion, is how do we implement concepts of responsible AI/AI ethics? Like, what do we do to move things from talk to action? So currently where we're at right now in the responsible AI space is that there are a lot of principles about how we want our AI to look like, but much less guidance on, okay, but like, what do we actually do? And so I am doing both research and working with companies hands-on to figure out how do we actually do this. And so the research that I'm doing is, theoretical, it's research, but then it needs to be rooted in things that are actually helpful and actually happening. So with companies, another company that I work with called Bria.ai, BRIA.ai, they are a company that actually develops AI. So they are developing synthetic images. And I am leading all kind of responsible AI efforts in their company, which is also a VP kind of role. But I think the title is better. The title that I chose is responsible AI advocate, because I think it's better for like reasons we can like get into later. But anyway, so you see, I'm developing things on the ground, what actually works for a startup, informed by my research and what's actually working. And then it kind of ties back into my research. So it kind of works together. And then because my mission is to not only help one company, but if I could, all of them, that's why I started working with the other company that is called Mission Control, which is where I am VP of Responsible AI. And what Mission Control is doing, they have a platform that is meant to help with just governance of data science activities and AI activities. How do we just like do it better? And a part of doing it better is also doing it responsibly. So my role in that effort is to conceptualize, what does it mean? Like, what does the company have to do? So obviously they should identify what areas of risk matter to them, are relevant to them. And then they should develop policies. And what I came to in my research is that I'm thinking of it in three pillars. So they should increase their knowledge of responsible AI and things that pertain to them specifically. They should figure out how to integrate that knowledge into their workflow so they're actually implementing things. And they should have oversight structures, including external oversight, to keep themselves accountable. And so what I'm doing in Mission Control is developing and kind of helping integrating that framework into the mission control platform so that companies are able to take themselves through their journey. So what I do in this capacity, as VP of Responsible AI, is conceptualize projects and formulate them in general terms, so that kind of anyone can benefit from. I don't know, like it's almost like if I could scale AI ethics consultants, that's kind of what I'm doing, but I'm not
Right.
doing the technical side of things. Like I'm not coding. There are other people, wonderful people
Right.
who do that. I'm creating like the thought process behind it. And then my other work that is also kind of like VP kind of work, but I'm calling it by a different name because of like reasons we could get into, is like just like leading all the responsible AI efforts in that company. So both coming up with strategies with everyone and then helping the implementation. And then the other side of the things that I do investors, I'm taking the same framework that I'm developing about how to basically evaluate the responsible AI maturity of a company and then figuring out what the
Translate
next
that
steps
to the
are.
investor. Yeah.
Because I want the investors to be able to do this evaluation, and also after they make a decision to invest, to be able to guide the company to improve. So that's kind of the different things that I'm doing.
Interesting. Very nice that you mentioned that you'd like to scale responsible AI, and maybe later we can get into the concept of, is it possible to productize something like that? Because it's a thought that I have, something quite interesting to get into. But before we do that, I wanted to ask you to get down a little bit to the implementation details. As a founder myself, right, I thought about what ethics, maybe specifically what AI ethics is. And I got to the conclusion that it's quite similar to strategy in the sense that it could be mission critical. It could really be, the difference between life and death. It's very interesting. It makes for great conversations. And last, if I put it on my daily agenda, I won't have the time to actually get this early stage thing off the ground. So I was thinking, what is the one North Star metric that I should look at, that I should, keep in my agenda, maybe review regularly to help me in that process?
Yeah, okay. So I would take a slightly different approach to this question, because I think the question is, suppose you have a founder that really cares about developing their technology responsibly. How do they actually do it while actually achieving all of their other business goals, right? Because they can't do this all day, every day. So it needs to be integrated naturally into the workflows and into the things that they do. So I think it's really important to be attentive to what the founder is already doing, what the company is already doing, rather than just doing something added on. Because of this point, you want it to fit naturally into the work that you're already doing. So I don't think any generic solution, because every company is different.
Okay.
And so what I would suggest, as kind of to get things started, going through a process of understanding, learning a bit about responsible AI or responsible technology, learning about what risk factors are most relevant to your business, both in terms of what your product is actually doing and what your values actually are. And then, choosing some things that are especially important to you. Maybe it's bias and fairness. Maybe it's privacy. Maybe it's both. Maybe it's more. Choose a feasible number for you. And then I would say, go through your work processes that you already have. So in fact, earlier today, I was on a call with, the person leading R&D in one of the companies that I work with. And that's what we did. We said, okay, what is your R&D process like today? Yeah. So we already know, with that company, we already went through the process of, we know what we value. We know what we want to do. So now the question, how do we bake it in to each and every aspect of the business? So for that, I'm just talking with the head of each department and thinking about, what are your current work processes. What are you currently doing? And then we're thinking together about where are those places that ethics perspective needs to come in. And so you start with, it's kind of iterative because you start with, okay, what are my values? What are my actual work processes? What policies I can come up with? Like, where are the places that ethics should be coming in? And do it in a way that's actually feasible for you, something that you could keep up with, something that wouldn't make it, in the way, something that would flow, just like you would do maybe with security, or something like that. And that is just a part of the natural life cycle of the business. So for example, one thing we did, we thought at the ideation stage, right, there's an idea for a feature and now a decision needs to be made. Are we going to develop this feature or not? So it's natural to think about, let's think about the business aspect. Is it promoting our business goals? Is it something that our clients need? And also, is it something that our technology is good enough at doing? So, for example, at that process, you can add an ethics perspective. Is this a good idea? Who is it going to harm? And you can do something similar for additional stages of the R&D process and other processes that the organization is doing. I hope this answers your question, even though I kind of took it from a different angle.
No, it does. It does. Like I was, in my mind, I was looking at this in a way. There must be a one metric that rules them all that I can, review on a weekly, monthly, or something basis to tell me if I'm on track. But your answer makes a lot of sense, especially if I think about something else in my background that's DevOps, right? I like your analogy with security, because security used to be a thing that in a IT implementation project you do at the end, and fingers crossed it's going to be all right, but it's not really something that you embed in your daily operations. And you kind of brought that concept back for ethics, which I think makes sense. In my experience, when you try to do that, there are a couple of things that you need to do. You need to work on the processes, as you said. You need to probably, there's a little bit of tooling to go around, but that's not the critical factor. The critical factor are the people and how they resist or accept this change. In your experience, have you experienced that? What's your view on that?
You mean when people resist?
Yeah.
Okay, so I haven't experienced it as much, but it's because I have selection bias. So for me, in addition to those two like ongoing roles that I have, I also do consulting and independent research. So I work with various kinds of organizations, and it is really important for me to only work with organizations who take responsible AI seriously. And that is something that's it's not that difficult to see. At first I was worried, how will I know? Because I don't want to be used like a rubber stamp. But it's actually not that difficult to see. And so from the beginning, I choose to only work with companies who are serious about this. I mean, sometimes I can't work with a company for other reasons, like I'm swamped. But sometimes it's because I don't think it's a good fit. I think they're actually looking for something else. I think they're actually looking for PR, and that's when I'm going to encounter resistance. So with the companies that I do work with, I'm not really encountering that problem as much as I thought I would. I thought that this was going to be a problem I'm going to be seeing all the time, but with the companies that I work with, it doesn't really come up. I mean, there are instances where, we might disagree. And I might say, hey, I think this is a big issue you need to consider. But they would say, but we really need to kind of get this feature out. And so we would need to find a way to resolve it. But there's, with those that I work with, they're really well intentioned and really wanting to do the right thing.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. You don't want to work with somebody that just wants to make a post out of it and put it on LinkedIn and then not take it seriously internally, right? And when I see activities like these going on, I'm maybe maybe I'm not right, but I'm always very cynical. I'm like, okay, is there some actual substance behind this, or is it just talk?
Exactly.
And I had a conversation with a friend. I'm interested in your opinion. He was saying, you know what, they can do better, but at least they're playing the game, and that PR, although not internally, it's still making an impact externally.
Yeah.
And for me, that narrative never flies. I don't know why. It's like there's something. If you're not honest in what you're saying, I cannot buy that narrative. How do you see that?
Yeah. That's a question that I've thought about a lot. Um, and yeah, I kind of see both sides of this. And I'll just kind of echo what you said and also maybe add a little bit from my perspective. I think, why do companies even want to have this, to show that they're doing AI responsibly? It's because there's something to be gained, right? It's because there's some level of social pressure to do AI responsibly. And so the part of me that is apprehensive is saying, well, you're using that pressure in the wrong way. You're using it to do the wrong thing. And so you're kind of alleviating the social pressure. So you get a reward for doing an activity that you're not actually doing. So in a way, if we help them do that, it could be counterproductive to actually seeing the changes that we want to see, because we're taking away the motivation that they had. So that's how I'm verbalizing my kind of, not sure I want to do this. On the other hand, like all things in business, it's gradual, it's a journey, and doing that thing could be the first step of people at the company increasing their awareness and increasing their commitment. Because sometimes it starts with making a public declaration. I want to do this thing. And you might not be doing it yet, but you have said that you wanted to do it. And it's the first step. So that's why I'm
Yeah,
torn a little bit.
yeah, you have skin in the game at that point. You have a commitment,
Yeah, which
at least
you might
partially.
not act on,
Yeah.
but it is something.
I see what you're saying. I think my dislike for this kind of narrative just comes from my guts, and I tried, to rationalize it. And the best that I could come up with is that, of course, you and I at this moment we agreed that AI ethics is a good thing. So if a company embraces that, even if not wholeheartedly, we could still find a reason to be happy about it. But it's not that every cause is a just cause. And in history, there have been moments where unjust causes have been supported, even by the mainstream media or the mainstream audience. So if you don't really put your mind into thinking, do I believe in what I'm supporting? There's also a risk that you're going to support something that's not beneficial for the community at large.
Yeah. 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 So I think you're saying, maybe you're adding, tell me if I'm understanding you correctly. There's a risk in AI that if you do it halfway, you might actually do it in a wrong way because you haven't thought it through. And
also, it also goes down to the implementation, but I was more thinking, on a higher level, on a what cause do you want to support level. So really put your mind to it, because there might be wrong causes out there. You don't know.
Yeah. Exactly. I know. Okay. On the weekend, I was walking around in town, and then there was a guy who wants to run for a city hall or some kind of municipal political position. And he was collecting signatures because he needed at least 300 signatures so that he could be in the ballot. And my partner said, yeah, sure. And he signed, but I didn't want to sign because I don't know this guy. Maybe he's evil, So to me, it's kind of like this thing. You need to think it through. Like, what are you actually supporting?
Yeah. If you're taking a stance, maybe it's not a good stance. So, be careful with that. Okay. How about VCs and investors? What's your view on that? Going back to, the financial side of this.
Yeah. Okay. So, as I said, my goal is to make all AI responsible. So the question is, where do you start? The big enterprises have a huge, huge, huge impact. However, they're more difficult to change for many reasons. They have their ways already. They can pay the fines. Maybe they feel less pressure. The startups, however, are more malleable. You're new, and they feel pressure from others, and it's more difficult for them to kind of take the heat of an ethics scandal. And a friend of mine he wrote a dissertation on the sustainability sector. And one of the things that he concluded is that in the sustainability sector, they're facing the same question. Do you start with the big corporations or the smaller ones? And what they've seen is when the small startups grow and they're sustainable, they put pressure on the big ones in way of competition. And so that made me think, I'll try the same approach here in AI ethics. So targeting the startups can make a lot of sense because of more malleable. They need the investors. They, maybe can't take the heat of a scandal as much. And when they grow, they will have an impact on the entire ecosystem. And so I thought, okay, but how do I motivate startups to do this? Money is a great motivator. Where is the money coming from? When it's startups, often it's the VCs. So that is what got me interested in how do I help VCs notice responsible AI? And, when I say this, a lot of people respond by saying, oh, investors don't care. And it's true for some, but I'm really pleasantly surprised to see that a lot of investors actually do care. And what they're missing, a lot of investors are actually not that familiar with responsible AI or responsible tech. So one of the gaps that needs to be addressed is how we make it accessible to them, because a lot of the resources out there are not targeting that audience. A lot of them target academics. They don't speak, the language of the financial sector necessarily. So some of the work that needs to be done for investors is just translation and making it accessible to them in various ways. And then the second thing that investors need, even if they have awareness and they want to do it, they don't necessarily have the tools. Like, what do they do? So that's why some of my work is also doing research with grants. And so I got a grant from the IBM, the Notre Dame IBM Tech Ethics Lab, and I'm collaborating with this organization called Venture ESG. And what I'm doing is developing a due diligence questionnaire for responsible AI. So due diligence is the process that investors go through. So in the company will reach out to them. They'll have some initial contact. They'll screen them, yes or no. And then if the investor is still interested, they'll go through a more thorough process of, okay, do we actually want to invest in this company or not? And so I'd love for this process to also include thinking of responsible AI. So that's why I'm creating, okay, but what do you even need to ask? How do you even evaluate the company? And so that's the first resource that I'm creating for investors. And I have plans for other resources later on. And I'm really hopeful that investors will get in the game.
I definitely agree with you. In my personal experience, investors are good people that have a very difficult job. They need to make money for their funds. And they need to make money taking a lot of risks because the startups are risky in nature.
Yeah,
I like your idea of the questionnaire that you're sending out to startups. It's actually one of the things that I wanted to talk about to begin with. And let me take a different angle, though, compared to what I was thinking about. How many of those questions that you send out are focused on the people rather than the idea?
What do you mean by the idea?
Well, the business model, the market. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So I think so this is my perspective, how I'm thinking of, when we're talking about a startup, and if I'm thinking VCs, we're talking about startups, they don't have a product yet often, or the product is not well developed yet. So a lot of the approaches that are looking at, well, do you have bias in your data set? But they don't have a data set yet. So what are we going to evaluate? So I think it is very, very important to focus on the work processes of that startup. So on the people and on the processes that they actually do. And when it comes to the idea, have they thought about this idea through the lens of responsible AI? So have they thought about the potential negative consequences? Have they thought about what harms, their users might be subjected to? And so I'm dividing it in a way that's similar to what I mentioned before, to those three pillars: knowledge of risk areas. What do they know about the risk that they're facing? And then the more mature a startup is, the more I'm going to expect. So if it's a pre-seed, if it's a person with an idea, all I can evaluate is the idea. That's all there is right now. So I would want them to, sorry.
And the person,
yeah, which is a whole nother kind of can of worms. But yeah, I can evaluate the idea and to see, can this person talk to me about responsible AI? Do they recognize the kind of risks and regulations that are really relevant to their startup? Do they know what they could do? Who do they have? Do they talk to, for example, diverse stakeholders? Do they talk to any experts? So what do they know about this? But as the company grows, I'm going to expect the knowledge to spread across the organization. So maybe I'll expect some kind of training. And when they actually have a product, I'm going to expect the knowledge to manifest in ways such as metrics and standards. And then as the company matures, the workflow, like if it's a person coding, I'm going to expect like a very minimal ethics intervention, quote unquote. But if it's a mature company, I'm going to expect some formal processes. The same for oversight. So I'm focusing on those three pillars. And then as the organization matures, I'm expressing my expectations in each of them.
I think have you thought of questions, and then that line of questioning makes a lot of sense. And historically, that's also the line of questioning that VCs use, right, for any other topic. So especially for very early stage startups, pre-product, pre-revenue, what you really want to get is a feel for the person, you want to understand this guy or girl, did she or he think about all the possible consequences, all the possible things that could happen in this market.
Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense.
And it's also something that you could see so this is something that you could establish in a conversation with a person. And one thing that I'm trying to do is also so I said that investors, sometimes they don't come from this background. AI ethics is not their full-time job and they're missing resources. And sometimes when they go into conversations with startups, they can feel insecure because even if I give them a list of questions, they don't necessarily know which answers to expect. Again, it's not their full-time job. It's a new thing. They're not sure what to do. So another thing I'm working on to complement this questionnaire is also a guidebook, kind of. Like, okay, like I'm saying fairness. What does that mean? What could you expect someone to know? Like, who do you even expect to be able to talk about this? And then I'm hoping they'll be able to both, when they go into conversations with startups, be able to navigate the conversations, know when someone is bullshitting them. But also, when startups give their pitch, it's really interesting to see what they choose to say and what they don't choose to say. And I remember I was once at a pitch, by a startup that had a product that I was seeing the pitch, and to me, some of the, risks to society were so apparent. I was immediately, whoa, like, why aren't they saying anything about that thing? The fact that they chose not to say anything about that risk and what they're doing about it says volumes to me. So I would like investors to also be able to do that. So without even, like, just from hearing the pitch, like, what did the startup choose to mention and what did they choose to leave out?
Yeah. And maybe again, for very early stage, you might be okay with a non-answer, I guess. But if you see that there's some thought that has been put into the matter, then that might be satisfactory, because that's the case for so many things about a startup.
Yeah. Or even to say, this is depending on the stage of the company, right? But if it's an early stage, like, I am aware that that X is an issue. This could have really negative impact. I don't yet know how to solve it, I mean, for so many things, right? Like, I'm sure they don't know yet exactly how they're going to implement the idea. That it's fine. They will find out, but at least they're showing. So, I mean, again, depending on many things, the stage of the development of the startup, the how risky the technology actually is, depending on many things. But sometimes it can be enough to say they understand the risk here and they have motivation to address it. Because one of the things that when I'm thinking of the role of the investor, it's not only to make the investment decision, but often they also support the portfolio companies later. And it would be fantastic if investors were able to say, okay, currently you're at this level with your AI responsibility or with your tech responsibility. That's fine. This is one of the areas that you are going to need to grow in, and we're able to support you. Here are some resources for you. Maybe we can give you a workshop. Maybe we could, same as the investor might say, hey, let me introduce you to your new CTO. They could say, let me introduce you to some people who can support you on responsible AI. Or here are some reading materials for you. Or, they could give them resources to help them grow.
Clear. Yeah, and that's true. So that kind of support on the hiring side, on the networking side, is something that comes typically from VC. I think the urgent question that I have in my mind, the urgent point, is that the problem with this is that the way the incentives are structured is very complicated because the VC takes all the risk at the beginning with the initial transaction. And then there are some governance mechanisms that might fit some VC's business model. There are some programs like the ones you mentioned that could be set in motion. But if you got the assessment of the person wrong, as a VC, typically you're not in good waters, right? Because you already committed everything you had to commit. The risk is already all taken. So that's why I focused in my first questions to how do you assess the person, right? How do you understand if the person is going to make the right decisions when those decisions are to be made? Because at the beginning you just don't know. You just don't know what's going to happen. Do you see? So that's why I focused on the selection side of things. Do you see anything that has the potential to revert these incentives, these mechanisms, not on the selection side, but more as you monitor a startup growing?
Yeah, okay. So I just want to add on the selection side. This is a very, very difficult question that is, of course, related. I think investors face this question on other business ethics issues as well, or any ESG issues, right? Because suppose the VC really cares about diversity and inclusion. How do they know that the startup is actually going to live up to that? How do they know that they can trust this person? So I think these are just generally really, really complicated questions. And I've heard people taking different kind of approaches to them. So sometimes they'll do a personality test. Sometimes they go by gut feeling. And I think they already have this mechanism in place. And I want to build on what investors are currently doing and just supplement them when it comes to AI ethics. So I don't think it's the personal qualities that you're going to need to be reliable in terms of responsible AI. I think they are very similar to the qualities that you're going to need to trust the founder in other aspects, which the investor is already doing.
Interesting.
Which they could be improved. Like, I'm not saying they're not, but I'm saying as a first step, let me see how I can add to their process with this responsible AI aspect. And build on the work that they're already doing in evaluating how trustworthy the funder is. So that's kind of how I'm thinking about it. And the second part of what you asked is, well, okay, now you've invested. Now it's been a year. Now the company is bigger. It's not just this person. It's other people too. So what are you supposed to do? And so this is, a question that they're facing in all matters, right? Like maybe even just on the business level alone, like suppose they hire people who are, they're fraudsters. That's not going to be good for business. So a part of this question is general. how do they make sure that the people that they hire are good people? And I think for that, VCs have their processes in place that we can build on, because I think with AI ethics, it's similar in nature. However, there are also things to add specifically to make sure that the startup is making progress when it comes to AI ethics specifically. And so there are a couple of ways to do it that I've heard of. One, the VC could ask for reporting every once in a while, like they do for ESG issues, for example. So they could decide at the beginning, okay, startup, we're going to expect you to report to us on whatever they decide, whether it's what policies you have in place, whether it's their fairness metrics that they chose. But this is something that they could talk about with the startup and include. They could include it. So like
in the terms.
They could include it in the term sheet as an official part of the contract. Another way to do it is add it as a side letter, which is something I've heard people do for ESG also. So, and add something like, this issue is important, like responsible AI is important to us. We expect the startup to progress on this, and we will support the startup in progressing too. And this goes back to something we talked about earlier in the conversation, like what is the value of making declarations? And one reason that's valuable, so talking to startups, I'll ask them, are you doing anything for responsible AI? Something that sometimes you'll hear from startups is them saying, we would love to, but our investor is not going to allow that. Yeah. So when you have something like that in the side letter, it's clear to all sides that there's not only is it okay, but there's an expectation.
Okay, and this side letter is not a binding document, but it's something that adds formality. I guess.
It's not like an official part of the contract, but it kind of comes with the contract. Yeah, so it's a way to signal this matters.
Intentions. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Didn't know about that. Interesting.
Yeah. And there's another layer to this, startup VC. There's the LP, right? The limited partner, which is the entity from which the money is actually coming. They also really matter in the game, because some VCs feel like, I can't really do responsible AI. This is not my money. I'm investing someone else's money. I don't get to make decisions like that. I just need to maximize profit. That's my only, But if the LP, the one with the one whose money is being invested, says in advance, actually, I do want you to think about like ESG or responsible innovation or responsible technology, that makes a lot of difference to the VC.
Absolutely. Because then you make it part of the job of the VC to satisfy the LPs in that regard as well. How do you reach the LPs?
Yeah, that is a fantastic question. So of course there are many kinds of LPs, and they're all positioned differently in society. Their money comes from different places. So this is a question I've talked to with a bunch of people. So there's at least a perception that some, like universities, for example, especially universities who are publicly funded, are especially sensitive to societal concerns. And I'm thinking ESG. So for those who are not familiar, ESG is acronym, because I've said it a few times by now, it's acronym for environmental, social, and governance. So often investors take these issues into account, and it's becoming more and more acceptable. So they take these issues into account when they decide who to invest in. For many reasons. One, they probably see their social responsibility, but also they realize that those factors actually do have an impact on the financial bottom line. And a lot of LPs already care about ESG right now. A lot of VCs, like increasingly so, care about ESG too. And I think responsible AI is just a part of it can be just a part of, I think it can be more, but also it can be a part of ESG. And so if you have an LP or a VC who cares about ESG anyway, I think it's not, it's pretty straightforward to say, well, this is just a part of what you're actually doing already. You need to look at, you need to look at this too. So I think that's that's a way in, especially with investors who are more sensitive to those kinds of considerations to begin with.
All right, and you said you find those especially in the academic settings.
So that's what I personally have not encountered that kind of divide, but I've heard of people who
All
think
right.
academics and family offices, and then pension funds. I've heard that these two kinds of LPs are more susceptible to those kind of issues. Personally, for me, I guess I've encountered more pension funds than others, but this is probably anecdotal. I would actually love if there's any kind of research on this to hear, what kind of LPs are more sensitive to ESG issues.
Yeah, are correlated with a higher interest in ESG.
Maybe, I don't know. Yeah.
Could be interesting. Let me shift to a more philosophical kind of question. So we need to develop responsible AI, which means that we need to build AI that meets what we think our values are, right? How do we define what our values are?
Yeah. A very, 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 looking at very difficult question. The way I'm thinking about this is in analogy to other business ethics areas, because I'm thinking we currently expect companies to have an ethics code generally. I think it would be really weird to encounter a company who doesn't have that. How do they come up with what their values are generally? There are many ways to do it. I don't think there is a correct answer.
What are these ways? Because I can only think of gut feeling.
Okay, so yeah, I was going to say that I have a way that I have in mind that I do, but I'm qualifying by saying I think there are multiple ways to do this. I think it's natural for there to be multiple ways to do this, but with responsible AI, I can tell you the process that I've been using. Hopefully it's helpful to people. Also, I'd love to hear, if anyone is hearing this and have ideas, please get in touch. Okay.
Certainly.
So here's how I've been doing this. And I'll say my process, and then I'll add some explanations about like why I chose to do it this way. Okay. So for me, it's really important when we formulate our values to not get stuck on that process for too long, because coming from philosophy, it could literally take centuries.
Forever. Yeah.
And and also when we do this process, to make sure that it's connected to some kind of actions that we're going to be doing. Because otherwise it's going to be really easy for that statement of values to just be a page on our website and nothing's going to happen with it. Okay, so I guess I started with explaining why I do things as I do them.
It's okay.
But
It's
a
okay.
process that I found helpful is to start with, for AI ethics specifically, get yourself a way to understand what AI ethics even is. Get yourself familiarized with some of the work that has been done, just a little bit. Make sure to look at some case studies. So this can all happen by, you can invite someone to give a talk, or do a workshop, but understand what AI ethics even is. Learn of some case studies of companies that are similar to yourself where something went wrong or something went right. Then ask yourself, for my company, what are the worst case scenarios? Like, what's the worst thing that can happen? Or like, not worst, bad. Or what are the likely bad things that could happen?
Bad in the sense financially or
ethically. Like, how could your technology impact people, society, and the environment? How can it impact them negatively, and how could it impact them positively?
Let me get stuck a little bit in that infinite loop that you mentioned, because if this is your process, this already requires a value judgment on what situation is bad or good.
Exactly.
Ethically, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's the point. That's exactly the next stage. So the first Just think of the things that could happen. What do you think is bad? What do you think is good? Write them all down. Then look at what you came up with. What is in common to those things that you came up with? Is it fairness issues? Is it privacy issues? What is the umbrella theme around those things that you already know you care about? You know, that is a way to, it's just a tool to bring out your value judgments that are already there. And so if you do it to the group, then you get kind of the joint values of the group. But then the next question to ask is, do not stop there. The next question to ask is, what do I do about this? What do I do in my company about this? How do I grow my knowledge? How do I put this in my workflows? And what oversight do I need to get myself to get things actually happening? And I think it's best to do this process with someone who is familiar with the field, because they can help you see things that you might be missing. They can choose study cases that you might not be aware of that can help you identify some risks that were invisible to you. It could help inform you of some of the principles that are already out there. It is also super important to find ways to integrate as many different kinds of stakeholders as you can, for a number of reasons. One, a lot of the work in responsible AI is very focused on the US and Europe. These are also, they have their own value traditions, and they may be different from the value traditions of your own background, company. Also, they may overlook some of the things that are really important to people in cultures that your technology is going to influence, right? Like people in
somewhere else,
Asia or Africa or South America. You might not actually notice things that matter to those kind of users if you're not going to consult with people who have expertise about those regions. And so to add to this process, I would say consulting with experts is really important, and consulting with stakeholders who are diverse, both in terms of their like biographical background, let's say, like gender, race, all of those things, but also the way that they relate to your products, like employees, shareholders, end users. They're all going to have different perspectives. And so if possible, again, different expectations from like a 2-person startup and a 1,000-people company. But if you can, find ways to gradually tie in those different perspectives.
Right. So, interesting approach. If I can summarize it, basically you're saying start from what made you feel well or made you feel not that well, and then generalize the principles from those empirical experiences. Then develop an action plan surrounding yourself with experts of a diverse background.
Yeah, and I would put the experts in the first stage. If the company is able to do so, right when they formulate their values, that's where I would bring the experts and the diverse perspectives. Also, I would include everyone in the company if possible, right?
Yeah. Okay. It's a very empirical approach, and it makes a lot of sense when you actually, you need to implement something. Because then you know where to start, and you have an action plan. I wanted to mention one last thing along these lines, and it's the along finding the values that you want to back. Because as you said, it's a very difficult question, and I'm far from finding an answer. But I find it fascinating because let's take an obviously good one. Which is like making sure your solution is fair. I think the concept of fairness is super interesting because we have a bias for fairness, I think. And maybe where it doesn't manifest, it's because we're very good at ignoring, at turning a blind eye to something. But we must have a bias for fairness. And I'm saying this thinking, for example, of something that you do when you study negotiation, right? You give €100 to person A and person B, and person A decides to split of that amount, and person B either accepts or rejects. And if person B accepts, then they keep the split. If person B rejects, then they get 0. And what you find out is that if the split is unfair, then a crazy amount of people will reject. And I see this from a two perspective. perspectives. From one point of view, it makes total sense. If I were in that situation and person A would offer me €1 and he would keep 99, I would say, no way. On the other hand, it's not rational, right? I'm better off after that deal, and he's better off. So going with your gut somehow doesn't feel rational when you pick your values, and also it must be dependent on the practical situation you find yourself in. What are your thoughts about this?
Yeah, I like this analogy. And I think it really brings out the importance of diversity in the development pipeline. Because in the process that you described, you have the two people negotiating. You are represented. You are a part of the process. But what we have often, in the tech world is overrepresentation of some people and underrepresentation of others. They're not there. They're not at the table to advocate for their interests. And that makes it easy to not see what they need and to not see the kind of negative impact that they're gonna, be subjected to. So I think that's kind of, definitely one of the problems. And I think your analogy really shows why this is a problem. Often I think there's just lack of awareness of a need because we don't have people from that population. Like we don't see that need. Other times, I think business interests can drive people to develop products that are unfair.
Yeah, that can happen. Yeah. Do you have an example? Just could be interesting to look into that.
Okay, the example that comes to mind for me that represents both, but it's a bit loaded, but I'll say it anyway. This is from a paper. This is an example from a paper by, I forget her first name, but Arun is her last name. So Facebook is a platform that has been a part of spreading fake news. In the West, we have freedom of journalism. So it can be easy to fact check. Other countries, however, don't necessarily have that. So if you take the Facebook platform as is and put it in a region that doesn't have this independent, an easy way for everyone to fact check, it can actually make the misinformation spread much more quickly. And so the damage of that misinformation is going to be pronounced. And so this paper that I mentioned by, I will look up the name later, but like that paper, the example was Facebook was used in Myanmar. In Myanmar, there was great violence against Muslims. Some of this, and also there's censorship on the media. And so what happened was actually government authorities opened fake accounts and spread misinformation and hate against Muslims. You don't have people who are able to fact check. So you don't have ways to show, like, this is actually false. This is lies about Muslims. And so the accusation was, and I think Facebook was actually sued for this, is that their platform ended up actually kind of creating genocide. And so in that paper, Arun says, Facebook should have thought of this, that this is in that region, given their circumstances, the platform is going to have more damage. I could see someone, from a Western country. I don't think I would have thought of this because I am so used to fact checking in media. I wouldn't necessarily think of, oh, wait a minute. If I didn't have this process to like stop and check, I could see it happening because I don't have those people represented. There's no one from that kind of country to tell me this is going to be really dangerous in this country because, people are the government controls the media. No one's going to be able to say this is lies. So you see what I mean?
Yeah, I get it. So you're saying diverse representation to begin with is the jogging to your long-term health. So it's the preemptive measure that you need to take to avoid these kind of situations.
Yes, asterisks. And the asterisk is, of course, the representation itself is not enough, right? Because if the person is there, but we never listen to them, that is not going to be helpful. So it's about the way that I'm framing it to myself. It's not about representation in the sense of having the person there. It's about having access to diverse views, which means being able to listen and take that in. It's also not going to be helpful if you're going to listen and say, well, thank you for your concern. Goodbye. Like, we need to actually tie that into what we do.
Definitely, because that's PR. That's just PR, right?
Yeah. So it just, yeah. And I would say, of course, the diverse perspectives is a really important issue, but not the only one. It just can be really helpful, but not, not the only thing, not the be all end all.
Clear. Okay. On this note, I'd say we talked for almost an hour. So great talking to you, Ravit. Thanks for joining the podcast.
Thank you. I really enjoyed this conversation. So I thank you so much for inviting me and for your thoughtful questions and for being such a great person to talk to.
Wow. Happy to hear that. Thank you. Okay. Bye, everyone.
Okay. Bye.